podcast, which is one of the sponsors of this event with Kingston Peace Council. And also I want to thank Novel Idea Bookstore for hosting us here and for providing some refreshments and ordering books. So I hope you will all, purchase a copy and you can get it signed by the author, whom I should introduce now by saying that Gabriel Rockhill is founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and is a professor of philosophy at Villanova University, but there's also global interdisciplinary studies at Villanova University, and he's the author or editor of 12 volumes, including most recently Domenico Losurdo's Western Marxism, a new translation of that work, and also author of the work we're discussing today, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, volume 1 of a 3-volume intended work, the group of which is called the Intellectual World War. So we're really delighted. We had our great event. He was here coming to Toronto and had a great event last night and at York University. And so I heard about this and thought, well, we're not that far. Even if we're small, we're a vibrant group, and I can see that there's a decent crowd for Kingston on a winter Friday. So kudos and congratulations for bringing out a real crowd. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I turn it over to you. Let's all welcome Gabriel Rockhill.
Thank you so much for coming out and spending a snowy Friday night with us. I'd like to thank Adnan for the invitation and all of the organization that's gone into the event, for inviting me in the first place, and as well for the bookstore for hosting me. What I was planning on sharing with you was about 30 minutes of comments that will frame the book's project and then also situate it in relationship to the second volume because it's part of a trilogy. Some of it is a little bit tight in the sense that it's developing an analysis of how bourgeois culture operates. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit of the overall framework. If any of it's confusing, then wave your hand and I will either slow down or go into greater detail or mark down some questions and we'll come back to them. I want to start with the important role of what Marx referred to as the superstructure. And the superstructure is the system of institutions and practices that emerges from and also serves to perpetuate a society's economic base, meaning the kind of mode of production of that society, if it be a feudal society, a capitalist society, a socialist society, for instance. The interesting thing about the notion of a superstructure is that it highlights the extent to which there are institutionalized material forces that fashion individual subjects and condition them, doesn't force them or determine them, but conditions them to think, act, and speak in particular ways. The latecomers, I think, are forced to come to the front and sit next to me. There's a seat up here if anyone would like to join.
We can put that one here.
Yeah, actually, there's a chair here if you'd like.
Yeah, one here.
And so one of the basic ways, yeah, I can also stand up, and there's a chair here. One of the basic ways that a superstructure operates is that it composes subjects in every aspect of their existence. It teaches them how to think, it teaches them how to speak, it teaches them how to perceive the world. And one of the things that Marx did is he identified two different major components of the superstructure. One is the political legal apparatus that arises within the state. And that is an element that kind of oversees the rest of the functioning of society. The other is the cultural apparatus, meaning the entire system of cultural production, distribution, and consumption. We can think in more simple terms. You have the state in the US example, and then you have Hollywood and Netflix and the book industry and the university industry on the other. These two components operate in such a way that they feed off of one another and also interpenetrate at deep levels that often aren't seen on the surface, meaning that the cultural apparatus under capitalism does not function independently from state interests or the state apparatus. On the contrary, the state often intercedes into the bourgeois cultural domain in order to guarantee that it function the way that it should function under capitalism. So for instance, if you're not familiar with the way in which Hollywood functions, just about every Hollywood film that is produced that has anything to do with the military signs contracts with the Pentagon that give the Pentagon complete censorship rights over the script, allows them to view the entire film before it's released to the public, and then make any changes that they deem necessary prior to its release. This is only one example of the deep interpenetration between the political legal apparatus of the state on the one hand and the cultural apparatus on the other. Now, historically, it's interesting that it was precisely in the late 19th and early 20th century that the imperial powers created a whole series of agencies within the bourgeois state that we now refer to as secret services or intelligence agencies. The desire to control vast new territories while lacking the conventional military forces to subdue them, coupled with the need to understand and counter the objectives of rival imperialist nations, led to a massive increase in secret intelligence, which used espionage to find out the intentions of rival imperialists and take covert measures to suppress potential insurgencies or strengthen client regimes in the colonies themselves. Now, when socialist state-building projects began to emerge and break the chains of imperialism in 1917, leveraging them out of the global imperial order, intelligence services served the purpose of trying to run not only trying, but running psychological warfare operations to manufacture animosity toward the anti-imperialist socialist state-building projects, as well as destabilization campaigns aimed at overthrowing them. Covert operations, which are, again, they're part of the political legal apparatus of the bourgeois state, but it's important to see them as integral to the way in which the state, and in particular the imperialist state, functions. Covert operations have been particularly important for the specific model of empire building developed by the United States, which emerged from the Second World War. The First and Second World War can generally be understood as a period of history of inter-imperialist rivalry to see who would be the dominant imperial power, the rival ones being primarily the United States and Germany. The United States emerged superior at the end of the war due to a series of complicated matters. And a number of factors contributed to the outsized reliance of the United States on what I refer to in the book as dual governance, meaning you have the political theater of the visible government on the one hand, and then you have another form of governance that's not subjected to democratic control, that often engages in illegal activities, and that is what some people refer to as the deep state, intelligence services, etc. And these two forms are integral to understanding how the bourgeois state actually works. Unfortunately, under bourgeois political science, we're not given the tools necessary to study how the state really works. We only study the visible government without focusing on the invisible government. So a number of factors contributed to the outsized reliance on these structures of dual governance, meaning the combination of overt and covert mechanisms or visible and invisible forms of government. To begin with, the country, the United States, has a long-standing tradition of imperial denial based on a powerful ideological narrative, which maintains that it broke free from the British Empire and established a democracy while promoting freedom and human rights. Secondly, it became the leader of the imperialist camp by defeating its major rivals, the latecomers to the imperialist feast, Germany, Italy, and Japan, in order to catch up with and surpass their well-established competitors. These countries had engaged in an intense form of imperialist onslaught that became internationally known and condemned as fascism. To win the war against them, the United States had to tactically ally with its erstwhile and future enemy, the leader of the socialist anti-fascist camp, the Soviet Union. The foundational ideological narrative developed in the United States when it emerged on the winning side of the war was therefore that it was resolutely anti-fascist and pro-democratic. Thirdly, the anti-fascist struggle continued after the Second World War in the form of the battle for anti-colonial liberation from the Allied imperial powers. The United States, in its desire to leverage colonially dependent countries out of the grip of the former imperialist powers, supported many of these struggles, while ultimately seeking to shrewdly integrate these same countries into its sphere of influence and its networks of global accumulation. Fourthly, Uncle Sam took over the leadership of the imperialist camp when, very importantly, it was on its heels. and socialism was advancing around the world as an anti-imperialist struggle of national liberation, from China, Korea, and Vietnam to the Congo, Mozambique, Cuba, Nicaragua, and beyond. The communist menace, so-called, had to be beaten back. But this war on anti-imperialist liberation needed to appear to be an effort to internationally promote democracy and human rights. Now, with this brief and general outline, we see the two contradictory imperatives faced by US imperium, which go a long way to explaining why it has arguably relied more on covert operations than any previous empire. On the one hand, it had to build its empire when imperialism was losing ground by waging an aggressive global war on communism, which included discreetly taking over the territories formerly controlled by the Western European imperial powers. On the other hand, it needed to maintain its ideological tradition of imperial denial and appear to be in the business of promoting democracy, anti-fascism, and decolonization. Now, in facing this impossible situation, the US state has relied extensively on its intelligence services to develop a veritable empire of spectacles, meaning an empire that aggressively advances its agenda while simultaneously creating spectacular forms of ideological obfuscation. You don't have the US empire without Hollywood. Hollywood is, and I'm just using Hollywood as a kind of metonym or a stand-in for the entire cultural apparatus of the United States. Hollywood is essential to everything that the United States does. Rather than solely or primarily relying on military deployments to directly subjugate countries, the United States has used propaganda, psychological warfare, covert operations, targeted assassinations, hybrid warfare, proxy wars, neocolonialism, on and on and on, to achieve its ends while trying to minimize blowback for its actions. Now, although many around the world see through these activities, particularly the victims of US imperialism, and left critics regularly decry Uncle Sam's hypocrisy, this contradiction is not one that can easily be overcome by having the state simply adhere to its espoused liberal principles. Adnan and I were talking about this earlier. This is the position that someone like Noam Chomsky, personal friend of Jeffrey Epstein, has discussed, as if it was only the discrepancy between what they claim to be doing and what they are doing that could be overcome by shoring up and improving the kind of democratic project, supposedly, of the United States. Like past empires, it would surely be easier for the United States to engage in an openly racist project of fascist-style imperial expansion, as it had done in its first centuries as a settler colonial slave society. However, it has been forced into these compromises by class struggle on the home front and the advances of popular forces around the world. The global expansion of anti-imperialist projects, particularly in the form of socialist states, and the world historical defeat of the form of fascism identified with the rival imperialist powers, in combination with the increasing global integration of people's social consciousness through transportation, telecommunications, and other such things, have largely discredited the open practices of a repressive colonization and fascism. Now, to be clear, this does not mean in the least that these practices have disappeared. It should be clear from the live-streamed genocide in historic Palestine. It is rather that everything has had to be done to try and make reality appear other than it is through the construction of an elaborate spectacle that's based on the totalitarian control of information. Billions of dollars have been funneled into propaganda, and scores of journalists have been the victims of targeted assassinations. Alternative news and information platforms have been shut down or shadow banned, and countless intellectuals and pundits have lost their jobs or been deplatformed. All of this and more has been necessary to avoid acknowledging the simple fact that the Zionist entity is engaged in a settler colonial genocide to advance the interest of US imperialism. In this regard, the first volume of this trilogy, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, the book that we're here to discuss, puts forth a dialectical and historical materialist account of the bourgeois state in the era of imperialism. It insists on the crucial role of dual governance, again, the overt and covert forms of governance, where the visible and invisible government work together to advance a common agenda, although there are occasional conflicts that I'd be happy to discuss. This is important to insist on to avoid the knee-jerk response, rooted in liberal ideology, that the analysis of the machinations of the so-called deep state is the result of conspiratorial thinking, or the assumption that there is a secret clique of evildoers who are pulling the strings from behind the scenes. This hackneyed social theory mischaracterizes the complex play of forces at work in the intricate system of governance that is the bourgeois state, as well as the broader superstructure. It is also mainly used to discredit those who question the institutions of class power under capitalism, as if it would be absolutely crazy to think, particularly after the Epstein file partial release, that the rich and powerful conspire in their own interest. In any case, rather than a conspiracy theory, what Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism provides is a systematic materialist analysis of the bourgeois state and its inner workings in the age of imperialism. If anyone is serious about refuting its claims, then the cheap imperial shortcut of making ex cathedra pronouncements about it being conspiratorial without examining any of the evidence would need to be abandoned as thoroughly idealist and devoid of scientific rigor, not to mention that it is clearly ideologically motivated. Refutation would require a meticulous examination of the facts. The second component of the superstructure is the cultural apparatus, right? So we have the dual governance operative within the bourgeois state, and then we have the cultural apparatus as the entire material system for the production, distribution, and consumption of culture. Culture is here understood, of course, in the most expansive sense of that term, including all of the activities that fashion human existence. In the age of imperialism, bourgeois societies exercise monopoly control over the production and dissemination of public culture, and they thereby have a degree of ideological power that is arguably unprecedented. A few years ago, Alan MacLeod argued convincingly that 90% of what all US Americans see and hear is produced by 5 corporations, just to give you a sense of the degree of monopolized, centralized control over not only the thoughtscape of the masses, but all of the cultural consumption. Now, this ultimately was one of the kind of fundamental arguments that I advanced in the book, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism. Far from being a free realm of expression and exploration, culture under capitalism is a highly regimented sphere of production and consumption that is under the dominion of the ownership class. Just as the imperialist bourgeois state is characterized by dual governance, the visible and invisible government, with the former tending to be more liberal democratic and the latter more totalitarian, the bourgeois cultural apparatus, particularly under imperialism, tenders a democratic stage that is discreetly controlled in a totalitarian manner from behind the scenes. This dual governance of the imperialist state is seconded by a slightly different form of dual governance at work within the imperial cultural apparatus. What I mean by that is that the bourgeois cultural apparatus presents itself as an open platform that is democratic, based on a meritocracy, and the best art, culture, ideas that arise through society arise due to the free competition of the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of culture. Anyone who actually knows how this system works understands full well that there's a whole series of constraints that are operative within that complex. It's not democratic, it is not based on a meritocracy, and it is controlled by both the owners of the means of cultural production and the managers who work for them, and it also works closely with the bourgeois state in order to guarantee that the type of culture that is widely disseminated serves the interests directly or indirectly of empire building. Moreover, the cultural apparatus plays a central role in the imperial activities of the bourgeois state. It functions hand in glove with the political legal apparatus to advance a common agenda. Given the unique nature of US empire building, the cultural apparatus runs cover for its imperial exploits, while diligently constructing worldviews that serve the interests of the ruling class. Although many US Americans recognize that their country is an active leader in world affairs and a major power broker, remarkably few understand it to be an empire. Where I teach at Villanova University, I regularly poll my undergraduate students. I ask them, do you think that the United States is an empire? And they all think I'm crazy. Like, how could it possibly be an empire? And then I teach them about the history of the nonstop expansion of the settler colonial project, which continues unabated today, which is only the kind of geographic and military dimension, not to mention economic, cultural, and other such factors. This is, however, just one example of the ideological effects of an extremely powerful imperial cultural apparatus, which formats social and moral consciousness to such an extent that it is capable of turning the world upside down. Moreover, the United States, like the other imperialist states, is engaged in an aggressive project of cultural imperialism aimed at imposing its products around the world and capturing the attention of everyone. In these ways and many more, the cultural apparatus is a key component of its imperial project. Now, as a superstructural outgrowth of the socioeconomic base, this cultural apparatus composes subjects in every dimension of their existence. It's not only a matter of formatting how they think. Affect plays a major role, and people's emotional nexus is formed in such a way as to foment impulsive reactions of fear, anxiety, hatred, disinterest, desire, passionate identification, and so on, that are often not mediated by consciousness. The ideology of affect is often much more powerful than ideologies that are mediated by human consciousness. People are trained to hate and reject particular ideas, particular peoples, without even consciously processing those particular affects. The same is true regarding morality and people's values, which are powerfully conditioned by the norms promoted in the cultural life within which they exist. The same is absolutely true of our perceptions. Now, there is, of course, a margin of maneuver within the dominant ideology and space for variation and subjective idiosyncrasies. None of what has just been said negates the existence of human agency and the possibility of changing our ideology. Indeed, this is one of the principal objectives of this book and the others in the series, namely to elucidate the ideological effects of the imperial superstructure and provide people the tools necessary to maximize their agency. There's a wonderful idea articulated, not to get too philosophical, by Hegel and then further developed by Marx, Engels, and others, that consists in saying that freedom does not exist independently. Freedom is only articulated in relationship to constraints, meaning that there's a dialectical relationship between the exercise of agency on the part of someone and a system of constraints within which they operate. In other words, real freedom is engaging with, responding to, and ideally overcoming the constraints within which that freedom operates, right? So if we're interested in maximizing our agency, we shouldn't just believe that people are free. We should understand the structural determinants in such a way that we can elevate and maximize our agency over them. And that's precisely one of the goals of the book and the others in the series, is to give us the tools necessary to at least begin to liberate ourselves from the dominant imperial ideology. Now, what I'd like to do, I haven't been watching the time, but I want to shift gears a little bit and cut me off if I'm going on too long. What am I at, like 15, 20 minutes or so?
15, yeah.
I wanted to just jump ahead a little bit then in the interest of time and highlight more specifically what the book is about, because I've been giving more of a big picture overview of some of the basic thematics and how to understand and approach to bourgeois culture, and then within that, the way in which ideas are produced and circulated. Part of this book is a methodological intervention that can be understood as the application of Marxist tools of analysis to Marxism itself. One of the things that Marxism does is it always raises the question of ownership and property, and it also situates intellectual production in relationship to the class forces and the economic forces operative behind that intellectual production. So at one level, the book asks a very simple question. Why is the dominant form of Marxism that we have in the imperial core this specific type of Marxism? And once you begin to understand the difference between this specific type of Marxism and the broad and deep and international history of Marxism, things start, at least for me, to come into focus. Because the form of Marxism that has been promoted in the imperial core is one that tends to obfuscate, ignore, or even argue against what's called the primary contradiction that structures human life on planet Earth. That primary contradiction is that there is a small group of imperialist countries that have subordinated, historically, the rest of planet Earth in order to take natural resources, lay hands on cheap labor, if not free or enslaved labor, and use them as markets. The dominant world system is what Albert Einstein referred to as the predatory phase of human development, in which the imperial countries prey off of, in a predatory manner, the rest of the world. If you do not understand the primary contradiction, you cannot materially situate yourself coherently in the world within which we live. It so happens that Marxism historically developed as the principal materialist science to understand imperialism and its deeper roots in the colonial capitalist project, and very importantly, how to fight and win against it, which is the project of developing socialism in the real world, not in one's mindscape or in some type of utopian la-la land. What's unique then about a lot of the Marxism that has become most prominent in the imperial core is it not only obfuscates, downplays, or attempts to deny the material reality of imperialism, it also tends to reject the principal mechanism by which peoples of the world, our brothers and sisters around the world, humanity on planet Earth, has fought and won against imperialism, which is actually existing socialist state-building projects. None of this means that you have to morally and blindly simply say everything that has ever waved the flag of socialism is perfect, and I think it's great because it says that it's socialist. You have to engage in a materialist analysis and recognize the contradictions, the setbacks, the difficulties, everything that goes into breaking the chains of imperialism and liberating humanity and planet Earth from its death grip. That form of Marxism, then, is the dominant form of Marxism because it's anti-communist and it obscures the primary contradiction. If you look into the material history of these forms of Marxism, it's not only that they've been promoted within the dominant cultural apparatus of the imperial core, meaning the institutions of higher learning and all of the kind of broader book industry, conference industry, and everything else, it's also that the capitalist ruling class has very explicitly outlined and implemented a project of supporting this form of Marxism. The Rockefellers, the Fords, the Carnegies have funded Marxism of the imperial sort, meaning the type of Marxism that is anti-communist and also obscures or denies the principal contradiction. And this is part of the archival record. Why would they do this? Well, they did this because they recognized, just circling back to my earlier comments, that in the wake of World War II, communism had a level of global credibility that is hard for most people to imagine today. It had defeated Nazism. It had defeated Nazism because the current numbers are 35 million Soviets and as many as 35 million Chinese gave their lives fighting fascism, and they won. The US, just to take that example, did lose 400,000 soldiers. 400,000, right? Not the number that I just mentioned. It did enter the war on the side of the Soviets because it was trying to ally and leverage power for its own project of imperialist production. And who were the leaders of the global anti-colonial struggle, particularly the struggles that fought and won state power? It was the socialists in Vietnam and Korea and many other places in China, etc. So what you had at the close of World War II is public consciousness on a global scale largely, not entirely, but largely recognized that there's something to this communism thing. It seems to be able to defeat Nazism, and it seems to be able to liberate what Lenin referred to as the slaves of the colonies. And this was widely recognized. Picasso, right, the most famous artist of the 20th century, said that project is right. So what the capitalist ruling class had on its hands was a fundamental ideological problem. How do you deal with that? How do you get rid of that? Now, someone who's not that smart would say, well, let's just try to turn all of the people who are oriented towards Marxism into right-wing fascist ideologues. That's very difficult to do. The people running these psychological warfare operations, who are the managers for the major foundations, as well as the members of the intelligence services of the imperialist states, are for the most part highly trained intellectuals. The primary site of recruitment is the university, in particular the Ivy League schools. These are highly educated people. What did they decide to do, and what have they spelled out very clearly, not only in internal documents, but firsthand testimony, is they said, we've got to go with a soft sell approach. We have to cultivate a form of Marxism that allows people to self-define as Marxist, keep it as if subjectively they kept their fundamental orientation, while at the same time creating the conditions by which that Marxism could move a little baby step to the right, another little baby step to the right, and cozy up to a position that was ultimately Marxist in theory, anti-communist in practice. This is why the Rockefeller Foundation funded what they called the Marxism-Leninism Project. And they funneled into this the equivalent today of millions of dollars. They were paying Marxist intellectuals, and the same thing was going on with the enormous networks of the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence services. They wanted to shore up a version of Marxism that could serve implicitly or explicitly the interests of empire. One of the features of this was to then support the Institute for Social Research, known colloquially as the Frankfurt School, because they were identified as playing a very important role at various different levels, one of which was that, and I don't only do archival research, I've also requested scores and scores, or filled out scores and scores of Freedom of Information Act requests, and been able to receive the internal documents from the government that demonstrate this. They identified, particularly in the case of Adorno and Horkheimer, that these were people who thought that Hitler and Stalin were largely equivalent, that fascism and communism, in spite of a world war in which millions of people died, was somehow the same thing. And this corresponded directly to the type of work that they wanted to foster, as well as the fact that they wanted to introduce and further develop forms of US American bourgeois social science in Western Europe in the post-war era, because they were engaged in what they call doctrinal warfare. They recognized that dialectical and historical materialism, the Marxist tradition, provides a holistic, materialist explanation of the world. It allows people to understand what imperialism is, how to fight against it. It gives people a holistic worldview. What they needed was a rival philosophy. And that rival philosophy had to appear to address the same material realities, while ultimately providing a framework that was compatible with the interests of capital. The way they described this internally is that they wanted to shore up a compatible left, meaning a non-communist left, or what they also call a respectable left. Now, the framework of the book is that the first half of it is dedicated to outlining the overall architecture of the imperial superstructure, and I focus primarily on the United States. So going through a whole series of internal documents as well as just historical work on the time period, I bring to the fore the ways in which the entire trilogy, of which this is the first part, can only really be understood if you can map out the overall complex web of relations within which intellectual work takes place. One of the reasons for this is that the book rejects the standard way in which we're trained ideologically to think about bourgeois culture. Usually we're trained, at least within the arts and humanities, it's slightly different in the bourgeois social sciences, to think that, well, art and culture is something that's produced by a free individual who is getting in touch with their inner feelings, their soul, their thoughts about ideas, and creating something that's relatively unique. It's a very modern idea if you know the history of cultural practices, but what it does is it starts with the individual as the source point for cultural and intellectual production. Now, my book starts the other way around because I take it that this is a false starting point. There aren't isolated individuals who live in a vacuum or are disconnected from human society. All individuals are brought into the world through a set of material relations that make it such that not only are they social animals, they're dependent on the societies within which they emerge for their language, their conceptual framework, their perceptions, and everything else, not to mention their material survival. In that regard, then, what the book attempts to do is outline the material institutional force field within which individual intellectuals operate. What this allows us to do is not take individual intellectual production and mechanistically reduce it to some kind of economic base or something along these lines. These are all unfortunate misrepresentations of Marxist cultural analysis. Instead, what it does is it provides an organic analysis of the social totality so that we can situate subjects within that overall social totality and understand that they exercise their agency, they made choices, and I'll take the liberty of citing Adnan, who has shared with me a sentence that I should have put in the book, but I'm going to put in the second volume, which is that human beings make their own ideas. That is certainly true, but not, and even never, in conditions of their own choosing. They operate within a particular material world. That dialectical relationship between subject and system is absolutely essential to understand if we want to elucidate how cultural production actually operates. The other reason it was important for me to outline this overall architecture is because the system, the material system within which these subjects operate, exercises a whole series of, or I should say implements a whole series of constraints over what can and cannot be done, and there's a system of rewards and punishments that train individuals within those systems to behave, to speak, to write in particular ways. If you operate within those systems, you very quickly understand, and it becomes a kind of ingrained disposition. This is what, if there are any musicians here, everybody understands, this is what the music industry wants, right? This is what the movie industry wants. And there's variability, and there's different production houses, etc., but there's general understanding of what the system demands if you want to take the social elevator. The intellectuals looked at in this book exercised their agency. Some of them engaged in very important analyses, but they were also situated within an overall material system in which they wanted to climb the social ladder, and in fact, very aggressively. Horkheimer, the early director of the Frankfurt School, hired a public relations firm in order to promote their work, and they were kind of almost slavishly seeking out both corporate sponsorship and state sponsorship. And this is all very well documented in correspondence and in their and in internal documents, for that matter. And so what you have is a relationship in which the system of cultural and intellectual production exercises its agency by trying to condition the subjects within it. And the subjects within it, if they want to be elevated and get uplift from the system, have to find ways of giving to it more or less what it wants. And so the best way of understanding the development of what's referred to as Western Marxism is an analysis of the social totality that produced this phenomenon, and in particular, the forces of this broad imperial superstructure. The second half of the book then turns more specifically to the Frankfurt School and examines a number of factors. I'll just touch on a few very quickly. One is that the overwhelming majority of the Frankfurt School scholars who sought exile in the United States during World War II or prior to it, because the majority of them were Jewish and saw the writing on the wall with the rise of Hitler, they did not work in universities. They did not work independently funded by the Institute for Social Research. Their principal employer was the bourgeois state, the US state, and more specifically, usually for the intelligence services. They worked for the OSS, the predecessor organization of the CIA. They worked for the State Department. They worked for the Office of War Information, which is a propaganda agency. They worked for Voice of America. They worked there are 8 of them, for a combined total of over 50 years. So they didn't just work there during the war, they weren't just involved in the anti-fascist struggle, they continued, many of them after the war. And when they moved to the university, actually the contacts that they had forged within the US national security state served as a springboard for very prestigious appointments. Prior to World War II, the Frankfurt School, published in German, was largely disconnected from the larger Anglophone debates, after World War II, all of a sudden you have these figures who have positions in the University of California schools, at Harvard, at Columbia, at the New School. They are named at some of the most prestigious institutions in the world. And as I point out in the final chapter, because I look at the work of Herbert Marcuse, who is importantly identified as the most radical member of the Frankfurt School, to a large extent due to his radicalization from the anti-war movement, the women's liberation movement, the movement for gender and sexual liberation, the ecological movement even, and there's no doubt that in Marcuse's trajectory there's a process of radicalization. If you follow out his early work though and go through the archive as I've done, you discover that he worked for the State Department and he was considered one of the leading experts on global communism, and he contributed to the State Department's war on communism, actually advocating for the shoring up of social democratic forms of governance within the Western world to demonstrate that it was superior to the Soviet Union. It's what's referred to as the Bolin line within the State Department that did have an important impact on the debates within the State Department because, of course, there are internal debates. But when he moved to the university, he went to the Russian Institute at Columbia and the Russian Research Center at Harvard. It's important to know why and how and under what circumstances. First of all, he still was under contract with the State Department, so he was simultaneously a State Department contractor and a university professor. Second of all, if you know the history of these two institutions, they were the first two area studies programs in the United States, and they are what scholars refer to as intelligence cutouts. What I mean by that is that they took major segments of the OSS and then State Department that were focused on developing intelligence against the Soviet Union, and they relocated them to Morningside Heights and integrated them into the Russian Institute. And the connections that were operative were such that it was the administration of Columbia and Harvard working with intelligence operatives and the top brass of the intelligence operatives in Washington in order to establish area studies programs in which academics who'd been hired by the state could continue doing the same type of research they'd been doing for OSS, State Department, etc., but under academic cover. They did the same thing at Harvard, where Marcuse was as well. What this demonstrates is an important theme of the book, which is the military-industrial academic complex. We have to understand that the military interests of the state are not somehow separate from the financial interests of Wall Street. The state that we have is the state of the ownership class. It is their state, and this has been demonstrated at so many levels. Everyone in the US Congress is a millionaire. There's a great study that was done at Princeton, 8-10 years ago, that demonstrates that the average citizen in the United States has little to no impact on public policy, but major corporations do. It is the state of the ownership class, on full display with a financial oligarchy during Trump's inauguration, for instance. But the other pole in that is the academic sector, the pundits and the intelligentsia, who are operating within a kind of triangle of power in which one of the principal roles of agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency is not the production of information, as Ralph McGehee, who worked for 25 years in the CIA, explained, it's the production of disinformation. And the war of ideas, as innumerable internal documents demonstrate, is the principal war. Because if you own people's minds and their hearts, then all of the other military skirmishes, all of the other deployments can fall in line. In the long run, as they say, the pen is mightier than the sword, which is not to say that they don't use the sword and the machine gun and bombs and torture and everything else, but it is really essential to what they're doing. One of the other things that I demonstrate, and I'll wrap up here in a moment, and I'm sure that we'll have a good and hopefully engaged discussion, is that Marcuse unfortunately lied about his relationship to the state. And I demonstrate this very clearly in the book because there's a number of interviews where he says, the Central Intelligence Agency, I had nothing to do with the Central Intelligence Agency, and he makes just false claims about the relationship between the agencies that he should have known because, he was working there. But I reproduce in the book the State Department description of his job, which was to produce intelligence for the intelligence agencies, including the Central Intelligence Agency. And one might think to oneself, oh, well, maybe he just wasn't doing his job because he was a wily, radical who was working against the system or things like this. Tim Mueller, who has spent more time in the Marcuse archive than any other person that I know, wrote, I think it's an 800-page book in German, in which he clearly demonstrates that Herbert Marcuse was involved at a minimum in the process of drafting at least 2 national intelligence estimates. The national intelligence estimates are the highest form of intelligence for the US government, and they have an outsized importance for the definition of US foreign policy. In that regard, Marcuse was misrepresenting what he was involved in, and if you look through the acknowledgments of every major book that he published that wasn't a collection of interviews or essays, like a book that he actually published, every single one of them, to the end of his life, was vetted by a current or former member of the intelligence services and their broader network within the US national security state, which is a little bit disheartening. I should also say, on a personal note, I did not go into this research thinking, I don't like Marcuse, I've got an axe to grind, I really want to take him down, or anything like that. On the contrary, when I was first exposed to Marcuse, he had a radicalizing effect, and I thought, oh, this is great. This is a guy who actually participates in protests and wants to change the world and learn from Angela Davis, and there's a lot of good and interesting things in Marcuse, and I don't deny any of that in the book, because it's important to see that human beings are complex human beings who have different dimensions to them, they grow over time, they change, etc. But I was forced myself to recognize the facts and to try to make the facts square with the dominant narrative about Marcuse. Didn't work out because the facts were overwhelmingly clear, and therefore I had to change the nature of the narrative. The last thing that I'll say, I think, will be that what's interesting, and this relates to the second volume, is that I looked at the foundational elements of Western Marxism by analyzing the Frankfurt School, and in particular the ways in which big capital, the Rockefellers in particular, funded the Frankfurt School, both individually and collectively. Marcuse actually was the intellectual point person for the Rockefellers' Marxism-Leninism project, along with Isaiah Berlin, a well-known rabid anti-communist. But there's also the broader history of Western Marxism, which I touch on. But what's very important to recognize is that the intellectual world war that was funded and supported by the superstructure of the imperial powers, mainly the ruling class through their foundations and the imperialist states, also continued these types of projects in other geographic regions and other forms of intellectual production. And so the second volume is entitled French Theory Made in USA, and it looks very specifically at the promotion of French theoretical developments, the second and following generations of the Annales School, what's referred to as structuralism, or is more generally known as kind of postmodern French theory, and you find a remarkably similar pattern. It's not only that there's the same pattern, often it's the exact same people who are involved. You have the same funding institutions, Ford and Rockefeller in particular. You have the same intelligence services that are interested in developing rival philosophic frameworks to dialectical and historical materialism. You have the same institutional network, so much so that if you actually analyze the material system of knowledge production instead of approaching it individually, or assuming, as I was trained, that, well, there's the Frankfurt School that's Marxist and materialist and they want to change the world, and then there's the Pomo people who just think that everything's a text and you can interpret and there is no real world, maybe, at least in extreme cases. That's how I was trained, at least as an undergraduate, before I started to realize a little bit more. But when you look at the foundational ideologies that undergird them, they share the basics. The basics are anti-communism and an obfuscation or denial of imperialism, as well as, in many cases, a practical dedication to overthrowing actually existing socialism. And as I demonstrate in the second book, actually Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault were both directly involved in anti-communist destabilization campaigns that were funded and supported, in the case of Derrida, by the National Endowment for Democracy. It was established in 1983 for some complex reasons I could go into, but the founder of the NED said that, well, we do overtly today what the Central Intelligence Agency did in the past covertly. And so as well as the Thatcher Foundation and many other things. And he was involved in anti-communist destabilization campaigns in Czechoslovakia, just like Foucault was in Poland. And I'd be happy to talk more about this. But the final example, and then we'll open up, unless Adnan, you have questions, comments, or want to jump in, is that to bring this kind of web to a point, Herbert Marcuse in 1958 was funded by the Rockefellers to spend a year in Paris. The institution where he was sent was one of the first area study programs in France that was funded by the Rockefellers. Ford was also involved. The goal was to develop a form of area studies that was very similar to what was going on at the Russian Institute that I mentioned a moment ago at Columbia and the one at Harvard. So much so that Fernand Braudel, one of the famous figures of the Annales School, and others from this institution were brought and toured through and met many of the leaders of these different schools because they were trying to develop in France the same type of area studies programs that they were in the US, which were intelligence service cutouts. That institution, l'École pratique des hautes études, it's the 6th section of the Practical School of Higher Studies, that would later become in 1975 the École des hautes études en sciences sociales, or the School of Higher Studies in the Social Sciences, was not only the center for the Annales School, it was the bastion for French structuralism, or what's referred to as French theory. What was Marcuse, funded by the Rockefellers, doing in France? His mission was very explicit. His mission was to convert the French intelligentsia to compatible left positions without making them give up on their Marxism. So here we see some of the broader international architecture of what I refer to in the book as the intellectual world war, meaning the war on the most dangerous philosophy known to the imperialist powers, and that philosophy is dialectical and historical materialism. Thank you.